Connie Feeser will be the new president, and Josh Hartranft will be the vice president. Normally, they do a presentation this month, but because they're brand new to the board, we are going to have them do it in December.
All right, this will be our first time in our meeting for public comments, aside from Mr. Kramer and our staff. I don't see any public. All right, so moving on. Phyllis, you're up.
So I think Scott is actually gonna
Oh,
go
he's
first.
the first guy, all right.
Before Scott starts, for the new board members, if you looked at your budget calendar, November is the time that we look at debt service. So debt service meaning the mortgage on all the properties that we own and the renovations we're doing and the construction we're doing. And so last several years, we've invited Scott to come and do that presentation. And Scott's actually going to take just a couple extra minutes tonight for those of you that are new, to kind of just bring you up to speed with this process and where we're at, and then he'll take any questions you have, right?
Yeah, no, I thought we were going to talk about the Dodgers, but that's okay.
Oh,
I'm good about that.
you can start with that.
So I thought we would start with, so welcome to the new board members. I thought we'd start with some interest rate history. The first slide, I'm not sure, Phyllis, you can slide, there we go.
David.
Thank you, Dave. So the first slide is a snapshot of the 10-year MMD, and for those who are new board members, the MMD is simply the municipal yield curve, similar to treasuries. You can see on this chart going back to 2000, the trend over the last many years has been declining interest rates. And more importantly, the box surrounded in blue at the lower right-hand corner shows you what's been happening more recently, since 2017. If you go to the next page, you can see that box blown up, really to show the impact of COVID-19 in March of this year, where you see the trend was for lower interest rates. We saw a significant disruption in the financial markets. There was a period of 2 or 3 months where interest rates had spiked, and now they've come back to normal, where now that we have some clarity, the election's behind us. We had some good news on the vaccine front this morning, so financial markets are now starting to think about what that means long term for the U.S. economy and forward over the next 2 to 3 years. And so what we saw today, if you caught a glimpse of the news this afternoon, equity markets rallied pretty significantly, almost 1,000 points on the Dow. Interest rates, which is what we're most interested in here in this conversation, the low was, well, at the height of the fever, below 0.5% on the 10-year Treasury. Today we bumped up right close to 1%. So we've had about a 50 basis point move in the 10-year spot of the yield curve. Now it doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're talking about $50 or $100 million of potential debt issuance, that adds up. And so what all that means to you and to us is that everything that we're trying to do to get the economy moving again, stimulus packages, at some point that is inflationary, and so the markets will start anticipating that. Even if it's a year or two down the road, the Treasury interest rate markets will tend to see that coming and be way ahead of it. So that's what's been happening in our world with respect to interest rates. For the new board members, these interest rate charts are important. Several years ago, we entered into interest rate hedges to protect the affordability of the project that you're in the middle of at the moment. Those interest rate swaps, we've terminated one of them. We're going to talk more as we go through the actual debt profile. But at the time, it was a much different environment. It was obviously pre-COVID, and the thought was rates were going up, and we wanted to protect, at least from the debt service side of the house, we wanted to protect the affordability of the project. And there's a lot of other pieces to the project, where the bids came in and things like that that were out of your control until you get the bids in. So that was what we were trying to protect. This chart shows you that quite the opposite happened. Interest rates have moved significantly lower. The trend was to the downside, and then with COVID-19, just accelerated to a place that we've not seen, historical lows with respect to every spot on the yield curve. So if you want to go one more page. This is, at the top of the page, the gross debt outstanding. And for the new board members, this is all the component parts of your existing debt, and there's 6 pieces at the moment. The series of 2008 in column 1, a little bit left on the 2014 bonds, 2018 bond issue. Column 4 was the first termination of the first swap and the first large issuance of $40 million for Brownstown Fritz and part of the middle school project. At the same time, columns 5 and 6 were a little bit of a restructure and also some taxable bonds to fund the termination on the interest rate swap. But if you look at the far right-hand column, you can see your annual debt service. Before we talk about any reimbursement that you receive from the Department of Education, your run rate's about $4.4 million a year out through 2024-25, and then it drops to $2.3 million and runs out to 2044. So that's your gross debt service before we do anything. If you look at the bottom of the page, there's some footnotes as to what the interest rates are on those various issues. Clearly, going into this, again, a little bit of history for the new board members. Before we embarked on these projects, the existing debt profile of the district was, there was about 3 years left on your debt, and then you were going to be out of debt completely. And so that set up very nicely for the district to finance these projects very efficiently. That debt profile 3 years ago was unlike many of your peers. You know, a lot of the folks around you have already been through very large projects, and they have very long debt profiles. Now you're step one into the overall financing, and you're going to have a, you know, even at the end of this, having a debt profile that's within 25 years is a very attractive debt profile. One of the things that we were mindful of as we prepared the plan of finance was we want to maintain the good rating the district has going into it. We want to make sure the project's affordable. We want to protect, if we can, not raising taxes more than we absolutely need. And that existing debt profile was key in that process. And then at the end of the day, 3 or 4 years from now, when we're looking back on the projects and how we financed them, that we didn't put the district in any bad place. We didn't back you into a corner, take any flexibility away from you to do the things you may want to do down the road. Again, it's a new world, but I think post-projects, you're going to be sitting in a very good place, having kept largely your cash balances, kept your rating in good check, so if you want to come back to the markets to refinance, you can do that. So this is what your debt profile looks out before we talk about reimbursement. So the next page simply takes that page and factors in what is a little bit of reimbursement that you receive from PDE. So if we look at the bottom of the page, on 2008, so you're not receiving any reimbursement. It's 100% local effort. 2014, 100% local effort. Same for the 2018s. You're going through the PlanCon process. In the event that there is reimbursement to be had for the projects, we will get it. We've estimated some small amount of reimbursement. It remains whether we will actually see those dollars or not. We've not anticipated those in the process. And then the 2019 was a restructure and had a little bit of reimbursement going back to the original debt. But you can see here the run rate's about $4.4 million again in the early years and drops to $2.8 million in the out years. Next slide. So this is a slide that, for the board members who have been here, that we have used many, many times over the last 3 or 4 years as we've planned for the project and ultimately as we've moved through the various phases of the financing. So column 2 on this page simply flips to the prior page. It's the net debt service in that column that we just saw. We're anticipating column 3 and 4 to be issued in 2021. Whether column 3 ends up being issued or not remains. That was kind of our cleanup issue that we're saving until the end, whether we use cash to finish the projects or, depending on how the bids come in, whether that needs to be more or less. Column 3 is likely going to change. Column 4 and 5 will be the issuance for the next $40 million for projects, largely for the middle school. And so again, column 4 is the debt service attributed to the $40 million that's going to come online. And then what's in column 5, because the interest rate market has moved lower, there's a termination involved in terminating that swap that will have to finance the termination. And so that's what column 5 represents, depending on where the market is at the time we terminate. So column 7 has been our bogey for debt service to where we were going to be at the end of all this, at a run rate of, call it just over $6 million. The really important part for the new board members is columns 9, 10, and 11, which is how are we going to phase in the additional mills that we need for debt service to fund the project. And so when we found ourselves in the middle of March and April leading up to possibly terminating, there was a decision by the board to kind of put the brakes on a little bit, postpone some things, and kind of wait to see what COVID-19 was going to mean to schools and this project in particular. And so at the time, we postponed the swap until next August, and we came up with a plan that would allow you to continue with the project, but also put the mills in place in column 11 in a way that would allow you to ease into it over a several-year period. None of that is set in stone. That's been the guidance that we've been working on with Phyllis and Adele. If there's a good year from a budget perspective where there's some areas of the budget that you can throw some more towards debt service, you may do that. Where there's a year where other areas of the budget are, whether it's PSERS or healthcare, whatever the case may be, and you need to put less to debt service, you can use your cash or other tools that we have kind of in our toolbox to massage how we phase in the mills over the next couple of years. The key to all of that is you have a great deal of flexibility to roll with those punches as you get bids in, as construction moves along, maybe there's change orders, the scope of the project changes, whatever the case may be. That existing debt structure that I pointed to in the very first slide allows you to do those kind of things. Whereas if you had $140 million of debt already on the books and you were backed into a 30-year existing debt profile, 30-year mortgage, just like your home mortgage, you would have a lot less flexibility. Here, we've been planning for it. The prior boards have done a really good job of putting the administration and the district in a very good place to navigate a sizable project. So I think that's the scoop, except for all of our disclaimers. I'm happy to answer any questions. I know that's a lot of information for new board members. We're always happy to take time in other venues to bring people up to speed. If you get home tonight and flip through those numbers and say, geez, what the heck was Scott talking about? If Phyllis or Adele can't answer it, we're certainly happy to come back and go through it again. I know it's probably not the top of your list, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Could you explain column 5 again?
Yeah, sure. Column 5 is, so at the moment, there is a termination value on the swap. So let's just say the termination is $10 million, terminate that swap. And as we've talked many times, when we entered into those hedges, we didn't care about the direction of interest rates. If interest rates went up, which we were expecting them to do, when we terminate that swap, you would have received a payment from the counterparty. When rates go down, you owe a termination, just like you did on the first swap when we terminated it. So at the moment, if that's, for example, a $10 million termination, we'll fund that with a financing so that you don't pay cash to make that termination payment. You're going to fund it with an issue. It's non-Laguda debt because you're not allowed under for new board members and maybe existing board members, Laguda is the Local Government Unit Debt Act. Whenever you issue debt, you have to file all that paperwork with Harrisburg. And in Pennsylvania, the Local Government Unit Debt Act, it's hard to say behind your mask, doesn't allow you to fund a swap termination payment with traditional general obligation bonds of the district. And so the way around that is you can either issue taxable bonds, which come with a higher interest rate, or you can issue what are called non-Laguda bonds or annual appropriation bonds. It's a little bit different credit than the full faith credit taxing power of the district. You're going to budget every year for the debt service, and so the markets will charge you a little bit higher interest rate for it. For example, if traditional general obligation debt is issued today at 2%, non-Laguda debt would be issued at 2.15%. So it's a slightly higher interest rate on non-Laguda debt, but it keeps you from coming out of pocket $10 million to fund the termination payment. long story short, for those board members who, just to refresh everybody's memory, the goal of that interest rate hedge was, we didn't care if interest rates went up or down. We were protecting a certain interest rate and a certain level of debt service for the project. Don't be alarmed if you're paying a $10 million termination, because that is essentially the difference between where rates were at the time we entered into the hedge and where they are now. So now we're gonna issue that $40 million in column 4 at interest rates that are at historical lows. We're gonna borrow that money at 1.5% when we thought it was gonna be 3%. And the difference is the $10 million termination payment. So you're essentially getting back to the same place at the end of the day. Now, as we've talked over the last year, one of the reasons why we postponed the swap during the height of the pandemic was the cash market and the swap market were not aligned as they were supposed to be. And so there was a mismatch between those two markets that was causing us some inefficiency in the way the mechanics of that all works. As of today, those markets are coming back to almost a normal relationship where treasuries went up to almost 1%, but municipals outperformed. And so you saw that big spike, it's come back to normal. It was still off by 20 or 30 basis points or 1/4%. It's now getting back to pretty close to normal. So who knows what happens over the next several months between now and when we actually terminate that next hedge. But at the moment, it's feeling better. That was an awfully long answer to your question of what is column 5.
Okay.
It's my apologies.
I was most interested in how you explained that offset.
Yeah.
When are we expecting to terminate or to cash in on the second part?
So we extended for a year.
We did?
Yes. And the conversation earlier this year was that'll buy, we don't know that we're gonna need the full year. You can terminate anywhere in between. If we see the market's good, we're officially moving forward with all the pieces of the project that you need the money for. So we basically said, markets are a mess, projects partly on hold, let's buy ourselves some time. So, yeah.
Fellas, when do you think you might need the money this year?
It's gonna be pretty close. It'll be sometime at the end of this year, going into the beginning of next year.
Into December?
No,
Or next year.
Fiscal year.
Fiscal year. Oh, yeah.
So like May, June, over the summer.
Okay. Right. Summer.
And this actually our termination would traditionally be August 1st of next year.
Yep.
So we should be
We
lined
have a
up
lot of time.
pretty close.
Yep.
A lot of things that happen between now and then.
Yep, we looked at the draw schedule from the architect and lined it up pretty nicely. It was pretty close.
I mean, theoretically, normally the rule of thumb is that, construction kind of slows behind what is projected. So we didn't want to go too out of whack, but it's pretty close.
And I suspect that the spring of this year, as we get some more clarity on the economy and the project, we'll be in touch and start getting ready so that if we want to go early, we can if the markets are such that it makes sense to do that.
Would it make sense to exercise the option when the interest rates are close to what we hedged on?
No, so
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. All you're really worried about is the relationship between the cash market and the swap market. If those two are functioning normally, as we've said many times, you don't care about the actual level of interest rates, whether they had gone up or they've gone down. We care that there's some sort of market disruption that would cause you to issue your tax-exempt bonds in a market that's uneasy for some reason. And again, when you're talking about $40 million of issuance, 20 or 30 basis points is meaningful. So we want the Treasury swap market to be perfectly aligned, or as close to perfectly aligned as we can, with the cash market. That's really whether that's at the termination date or whether that's in January, or the level of interest rates, we really don't care.
Okay.
Any other questions for Mr. Kramer? Thanks, Scott.
So the Dodge starting lineup for next year.
All right.
guess I should have let him start with that, huh?
Yeah, right,
You tried to.
I did,
You have an audience in the room that cares about
that
that.
appreciates that. Do you want me to stick around?
Only if you want to.
I don't think.
Okay.
It's up to you, man.
I'll stick around for your part,
Okay. Well, the audit's after me, so you may want to
stick around.
stick around.
Got it.
Okay, so next item on the agenda is delinquent tax update. And there are two things attached to your agenda. One is a PowerPoint, the other is an addendum. And the board members who have been here for a couple of years will recognize that there's a couple extra slides in this presentation, only two. So I didn't go crazy, but I thought with folks who are newer, I wanted to try to kind of circle back and just give you a little bit of history on this particular item. So back in 2015, we engaged in a discussion with a company called Portnoy Law. They are a law firm, but they, the purpose of their practice is to use the municipal tax claim law for folks who aren't paying their real estate taxes and go after those delinquencies. And so they do it a little bit differently than kind of the normal process. The normal process for a school district would be to follow the real estate tax sale law. And the way the real estate tax sale law is basically, at the end of the calendar year, those folks who have not paid their taxes get turned over, we call it the turnover, to the county. And then the county runs through the county tax claim process to go after folks who are delinquents on either school or municipal property taxes. And obviously following that real estate tax sale law. The other law that you can follow, obviously, is this municipal claims law. And the difference really between the two is not so much the collection of the percents, but really the cash flow. So when you follow the county system, it ends up being a fairly delayed system. When those taxes get turned over in January, the county really gives them kind of until April to make an attempt to make a payment. If taxpayers don't, they send them a letter not until July. And then it's sort of a real soft approach, and then it comes around to the following year when they actually start to kind of go through the process of trying to collect those claims. So obviously for that year and a half it could be, the money is not at the district, it's obviously in the taxpayers' dollars, or in the taxpayers' pockets. And so the municipal claims law is intended to try to speed up that process. So differences that I put on this slide is with the municipal claim and tax lien. 100% of it's collectible, so we're not paying anything to Portnoy. I will show you what the fees look like on the very last slide, so you just have an idea that it's not thousands and thousands of dollars, but that it gets layered on top of the tax, so it's not anything out of pocket to the district. Obviously, what happens is, as I explained, and you'll see it in the chart that I'm going to show you on one of the next slides, is it speeds up when the collections happen. And then at Portnoy, under the county system, they're only required to remit those payments to us every 3 months. Portnoy actually, bless you, remits those to us weekly. So again, the money's coming into the district, and when we actually have, so the bad news is, converse to what Scott said, we have low interest rates where we're not earning a lot of interest on our money right now, but theoretically, when interest rates are higher, then we would be able to earn some interest on those funds. The district also has control over, a lot more control under the municipal claims law as to how we go after those taxes. So we set the timelines. It can be shorter or longer than I've just described what it is to you, so that was our choice. We can choose to allow taxpayers to have payment plans, to go into hardship programs, and we do all that. So we've been in communication with Portnoy. Again, I think we're 4 or 5 years into this now with them. They pretty much know kind of how we're going to operate. We're trying to be fair to people. We're not trying to throw people out of their houses. We're simply trying to kind of vet the people who aren't paying just because they're trying to play the system versus the people who aren't paying because they truly have a hardship and can't make a payment. And so we'll take a pretty low payment over many months to try to accommodate that taxpayer. but just getting them to show us that they're willing to make whatever payment that they can make. And then lots of notices, as you'll see when I go through the process, to the property owners about the process, every step of the way. So again, in the county system, I was explaining to you, not a lot of notices, and this many more notices. The next slide then, and I'm just gonna spend a minute on this, you can ask if you have any questions, but 2015 would have been the last year that we did it through the county process, and you can see that black line. Thank you, Adele, for making it black so it stands out. You can see that black line. You can see how late it was into the process before we had a peak in collections. Versus you can see the more recent years, the blue and orange and gray lines where we've been with Portnoy, and you can see that peak is happening much earlier in the collection process, and that's the intent of this program. Next slide then just gives you kind of the numbers behind that. Again, what I would kind of point out to you is what is outstanding at June 30th, 2016 from the 15 taxes, which is the bottom right-hand corner. About 50% of them still outstanding 6 months into the process. Whereas you can see once we went to Portnoy, those numbers started to drop. It was a little bit higher in 2019, but we also turned over more in 2019. And then the next slide, as I promised, kind of just gives you an idea of what the process is. So the board had seen the first slide and this slide as we made the decision to engage Portnoy Law to do this work for us. And so I wanted to just kind of repeat it so you could, again, it's probably good repeat for folks who have been here for a while, but particularly for those of you who are new, you can kind of see, each step of the process, each step that the taxpayer is notified, and then what the costs are to the taxpayer for those notifications. Last thing I will say is before we go to sheriff's sale on any property, there's sort of like a last-ditch effort. They do send me a notice. Normally what happens is I bring those to you and just make sure that you're aware. There's the board members who have been here will tell you it happens a couple of times a year. There's a handful that I bring to you, and there are very, very few that actually end up going to sheriff's sale. Some people just need to get to that last phase of the process before the payment or an attempt to make payment is made. So we have just not had that many that have gone to that level. We are not alone in that we do this. I think it's only us and Salenco and Lancaster County, but if you want to see the client list, Portnoy works with many, many school districts across the state, and I can certainly provide that list to you if it gives you any comfort. So again, we are proposing, recommending that we go ahead and approve the addendum again to continue to use them going forward. We do notify the county once the board approves the addendum so that the county's on board and they know they're not to collect the taxes. So it does take a little bit of coordination. We don't want two parties going after taxpayers. So we'll actually write that letter and make that known to the county once you approve this on consent next week. Any questions? Oh, okay. And then next item that I have is policy review. So two policies for tonight, 706 and 707. So if you look at policy 706, this is our property, I'm going to call it our property disposal process. Many of the changes that we made in the beginning part of this are really just either designating folks or making sure that the titles match up to the folks here. And then when you kind of get into the 500 section of this policy is where we made some changes. Changes more for clarification than they are for actual, we're not trying to dramatically change the policy, but when we went back and over time, since Ken's been on board and now Joshua in technology, we sort of streamlined this process in the business office a little bit. And while we were kind of following the letter, we were following the letter of the policy wasn't quite as defined as we would have liked it for it to be, to lay out the process that we're following. So if we could go just back up to that 500, yeah, there we go, 511 section. And this is a culmination of bringing some PSBA language into this policy. So you can see that we are now detailing the methods by which we will sell property. And, you know, it does have to be, we can't just kind of give it to somebody. There is a legal way that we need to go through that. So these are some acceptable methods, and we thought we would kind of, in our policy, instead of just listing all the methods and then listing all the categories, we would try to tie the methods to the specific category. So you're seeing if something is in usable condition, then we're gonna go ahead and go through the sale or auction process. If it's something that we're gonna try to just get scrap value or recycle value out of, then that's how we're gonna flow through. If it's something that's junk, we're just gonna get rid of it because we've determined that it falls into that category. The one piece that is new, and this was in some of the PSBA policies, and as we, I think what's gonna happen is as we go through our building renovation process, we're gonna end up at the end and maybe have some things that aren't useful to us. And there have been some really neat stories across the county. Penn Manor is one of them, where there have been natural disasters in other part of the world, and they have been able to take some of the items that they haven't needed and get those shipped to places that truly do need them. We did not have the ability to do that under our existing policy, so we are recommending, and certainly your choice, but we are recommending to add this donation language that if we don't have a use for something for our purposes, and certainly if we would do that, we would still bring it to you. We're saying prior board approval is needed, so we'd be completely transparent about that, but then it would be in the policy that it would be acceptable for us to be able to get rid of the items that way. And then the only other thing that we added here, and this again was in some PSBA language, we have not had an issue with this, but thought it was a great idea to have some language in here that we're basically selling things to people as is, and they're taking responsibility for it. And we're going to try to make sure that, you know, there's something in the policy that if they try to come in and pick something up and, you know, put ruts in the grass or something while they're taking things, and we can sort of have a little bit of teeth and leverage to work through those sorts of concerns with them. So really, those are really the two areas that we changed in this one, if anybody has any questions. Okay, then we'll go to 707. And 707 is a policy that we've touched a couple of times, so not a lot of changes to this one. But there were a couple of areas where we thought it was important. When we go to 707-300, we are we've already embarked, I guess I should say, on a new work order system within Ken's department. But it's actually going to help us not only with that, but with our athletics and some other areas of facilities, rental, those sorts of things across the district. So we thought we needed to take the sort of written language out of here because it is an electronic system and gives us the ability to do things that way. And then a little bit of tweak to the liability language there that was something that was in the PSBA policy that we didn't have. And then the real meat of the changes to this policy happens here for what ironic reason, again, in the 500s. And one of the changes that PSBA had been recommending that we make was the tobacco language. And we are actually not following this language that you see in green is not the language that PSBA recommended. And the reason it's not is because when we updated our 222, which is our student policy for tobacco use or lack thereof, and 452, which is our employee policy, we crafted this language to be able to be used in both of those policies. And so we basically, Mrs. Martin, cut and pasted from those two policies into this policy to make sure that we're consistent. We actually had a discussion amongst ourselves internally about just referring to those two policies. Our fear was that people won't take the time to go back to the other two policies and actually look at the language. So we decided to repeat it here. And then the other change that PSBA recommended was, again, if you're on just up a little bit in 554, if you are using some sort of tobacco cessation product, that
that doesn't fall within the parameters of the policy. Other additions were the medical marijuana being prohibited as well. And then I think we had to make some changes and kind of group some things together just because we ran out of numbers in this section. But all of the other pieces with the possession of weapons and the conduct had been in our policy previously. So that's the bulk of the changes to that policy. If you have any questions, I can answer those.
Can I assume that medical marijuana was included because it's not federally recognized and we get federal money?
Correct.
Okay. My other question has to do with 707.220.
Okay.
As I read this, if I remember the public, I wouldn't really be sure what the deal was with the tennis courts. It explains that the track, you have to use the outside lanes.
Okay.
But the way it read made me think like, it left me with the impression that I didn't know for sure if courts were available.
It says it in another spot that courts are available.
Yeah.
I looked for that and didn't notice it, so if you could guide me to that. Because it says with the exception of athletic fields and courts, individuals are permitted to use outdoor recreation facilities at their own risk. And I couldn't find anything that explained how we handle the courts.
And we can certainly clear that up if it's not clear, but I thought it was called out some other spot, and maybe it's not.
Well, if you could just look in the
Sure.
show,
Mhm.
take care of that.
Yes, we can absolutely do that.
So I assume we're still allowing people to use the courts.
Yes, we're not changing
Yeah.
any of the usages or anything like, we're not proposing to change any of
That
that.
just seemed to have disappeared.
I mean, we just change the stadium field, football field to stadium field because it's used for more than football now, and it's a turf field, so.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I think that's it for that. Did I talk long enough?
No.
All right. Next item on the agenda, review of our independent audit. We put Carl Hogan at the end of the agenda because he was on a mad dash from somewhere south of DC to get here, so I'm gonna make sure he was here before I started to kick this off. Again, for new board members, once a year annually, we have the local auditors come in, so we get audited by two entities, well, probably more than two entities if you really think about it. But on a financial side, really two entities, our local audit, and then periodically we get audited by the state as well. Don't try to jinx us by saying we haven't had a state audit in a couple of years, so we're probably due for that one. But the local audit happens annually. And a number of years ago, and I think Mr. Talley was on that committee, right? We did an RFP for auditor, and we had been with our prior auditors, Brown Schultz, for a number of years, frankly, probably too many years, and did an audit RFP and selected BBD out of the group that responded to our audit. And so we've been with them for, I guess it's 4 years now, and it's, you know, an audit is sort of an interesting relationship because you want somebody to come in and really tear your stuff apart and make sure, you know, not just for our perspective, I mean, you want that as a board, so you know what Adele and I are doing, but we also want that. If there's something that we're not doing in internal controls that can be done better, if there's something that, you know, we can kind of shore up to make sure we're protecting the district more, something that can be lined up to standards a little bit better, we want to know that so that we can make sure that we make those changes going forward. But you also want to have a good relationship with your auditor, because when you don't, it just makes, it's an arduous process anyway, and it makes the process even more so when you don't have that relationship. So we have been really lucky and blessed as a district to have both Adele and Joanne Dipple who is our accounting specialist in the business office, who are just stellar people and put a ton of time into this. And we are also very blessed that Carl and Stuart on Carl's staff have come out and done both a very diligent job for us, but made it about as easy as you can make an audit be. So with that, and again, for those of you who haven't been through this before, the prior auditors used to actually literally go through the audit report. And Carl won't do that. He actually does it with a PowerPoint, so we'll try to make it, bring some levity to it. But you do have a hard copy at each of your place settings that Mrs. Martin laid out for you. So he may refer to certain pages if you want to try to follow along. That one is yours to take. If you don't want it, feel free to give it back to us, but we want you to have it so that you can refer to it. And the one thing that I say every year, and I'm sure Todd's going to nod when I say it, like, why do you always say this? But if you don't read anything else in that report, there's a couple of pages, more than a couple, it's like 10, called the Management Discussion and Analysis, and I would encourage you to read just those pages. It is the district's opportunity to lay out to taxpayers and bondholders and the public kind of how we view the district and what we're doing here. So that's kind of the most important part of the entire report for you to take a look at. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carl for his presentation.
I'm obviously not doing my job if it's that great of an experience, to be honest. So, all right, I'm going to do a quick synopsis of the audit report for the year ended June 30th, 2020. I think I've said this before, this is tough information to present, so I'm going to try to make it as quick and painless as possible. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. But if we can start with the first slide, this is just me trying to be, trying to make the presentation a little bit better. So, all right, next slide.
Are you done being friendly now?
What's that?
Are you done being friendly?
Yeah, no, I gotta get tough.
Next slide.
Yes. All right, next, all right, so obviously you're hiring us for, the main reason why you're hiring us is because pages 1 and 2. Pages 1 and 2 in your audit report is the independent auditor's report. And basically what this is doing, it is outlining what our responsibilities are, what management's responsibilities are, what responsibility we're taking for the different sections of the audit report. But ultimately, the most important paragraph is on page 1. And that's right at the bottom, assume this should be at the bottom, and that's the opinion paragraph. And the opinion paragraph basically states that the numbers that were presented to us by management for the year ended June 30th, 2020 were fairly presented. And I can say with pretty much confidence that the numbers that were being presented to you on a monthly basis are being reflected in the audit report tonight, so there won't be any kind of surprises in terms of numbers. All right, so first and foremost, I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important schedule in the audit report. And if you look at page 54 of your audit report, this is kind of blown out, and it breaks everything out by different sources of revenues, different functions of revenues, etc. The one thing I want to kind of lead into is, I could say that the district was financially set in a position to be able to take on, the pandemic, even though I'm not seeing it, there were some financial impacts that we're going to talk about, but just in terms of where you were financially going into the year, not that you would ever anticipate, this is a case where you laid out a budget at the beginning of the year, and I always say it never goes to plan. Well, here's the case, etc. So, up at the top, when you went through the budget process last year, you had $71.9 million of revenues budgeted, came in at 71.5, so that's a little bit of a negative variance. I don't know if we talk about that in the next slide. Typically, the school district the past couple of years I've worked with you, you've had more than, the economy's been good, real estate transfer taxes were coming in good, investment earnings were coming in good. Things kind of tailed off at the end of last year, resulting in the slight variance, but at the end of the day, it basically came in at budget. Expenditures, $66.4 million budgeted, came in at 64.1. That's a positive variance of $2.2 million. We'll talk about that on the next page. Other financing sources uses primarily consists of transfers to other funds and a budgetary reserve. Another positive variance there. So when you went through the budget process last year, you budgeted to use $1 million of fund balance. You actually added 1.7, which is being driven mostly by those expenditures and other financing sources being more or less than budget. And so that's a $2.7 million swing from where you expected to be during the budget process and where it actually came in. So beginning fund balance, $13.7 million, fund balance ending 15.5. I think that management's already discussed with you with that already, and we'll kind of go over some of the reasons why for those variances and expenditures. Any questions so far? Next page. So here is a little snippet from management's discussion and analysis. I would state that need some type of assignment related to that, since they happen quite often in the district. So at the end of the day, you have an unassigned fund balance at $5.8 million, and that represents almost 8% of the next year's $74 million fund balance, and that's within the amounts allowed by PDE. Next slide. So currently, we're spending a lot of time not only with the general fund, which we always spend a lot of time, but we're also spending a lot of time related to the capital projects fund. You have some major construction going on related to the Brownstone Elementary, and obviously the new middle school that's being built during the current year. Money came in related to new bond issues. So that money in the capital projects fund is being restricted currently for those two big projects that are going on. $32.1 million, which most of that is at this point in time, or at that point in time, was going towards the middle school. In addition to the capital projects fund, which accounts for the bond proceeds, the capital reserve fund consists solely of transfers that you make from the general fund to the capital reserve fund, and those are for like ongoing maintenance. So if you have a project that is of the nature that it's so big that you would have to go out and borrow money, you would just take the money from the capital reserve fund, so you don't have to go out and borrow money every time you have a project. No questions? Slide. Here is kind of a breakdown of the PSERS liability. The PSERS liability, as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a rundown of roughly the past 10 years of what the rate has been. If I even took that rate and went back to 2008, 2009, you would see that the rate was 4.76%. So you can see from 2008, 2009 to now 2020, 21, you've gone from a rate of 4.76% to almost 34.5%. To kind of put that in perspective, I'm not going to get too much into the weeds, but your proportionate share of Conestoga Valley of the negative or the liability that PSERS has related to, they have assets and they have an actuarial liability. Your proportionate share of that deficit that PSERS has is almost $100 million. It's actually getting better over the past couple of years, which has resulted in the rates on the right-hand side not going up as fast as originally projected, but still the same. We're almost talking about a third of a dollar, 33 cents on every dollar, going towards the employer portion. Now the state does reimburse half of that, but at the same time, it is a cost that continues to rise and will continue to rise. I think projections have it, the highest the projections are going right now are like 38%. So hopefully we continue to see investment earnings doing well, etc., and that doesn't get that high. The next slide. So we talked about the main things. We talked about, well, first, you do have two other funds. You have an internal service fund and a food service fund. Those are on pages 24, 25, and 26. They actually did really well last year, even given with the COVID pandemic, etc. One of the good things is that a lot of school districts that had their own in-house food service had to actually keep on paying all their employees and actually had losses. You didn't quite have that in your internal service fund, had a nice reserve in terms of that. So, plus with the internal service fund, you got to remember medical claims kept on falling off at the, towards the end of the year as people weren't able to go to the medical facility. So there is a nice reserve there in terms of in case people started going back in the current year. So we went over what kind of audit report you have, we went over what your fund balance is and all your different fund and your major funds. We kind of went over some other major things, and the final thing is there was no findings related to our audit over internal control. Like Phyllis says, we talk all the time about various things. We're always in constant communication. They check in with me about various things before they do them, but there's never to make sure that we don't have any findings or any kind of question costs. And once again, there's nothing that would rise to the level or even close to the level of finding that would need to be reported to the board of directors. Also, the school district does receive more than $750,000 in federal awards, which triggers a single audit. The major program we tested for the single audit was Title I. We had an unmodified opinion on compliance related to that. And then there's also 3 big reporting deadlines that management needs to meet. We have PDE annual financial report that was filed before October 31st. Financial statements, they need to be posted to Emma by December 27th, which will be done. And then the single audit should be done tomorrow. Fidel was just waiting to get the report finalized, and we'll get that done as well tomorrow. So, any questions, concerns? And then,
Could you repeat the page numbers for the food service?
oh yeah, the food service is on pages 22, 23, and 24. And that's the food service and the internal service fund, which is your reserve for your self-insurance claims. Other questions? Thank you. Oh,
Thanks,
that was easy. Thank you. Yep.
All right, board, you see in front of you the tentative agenda for next week. Any board concerns or board matters tonight?
Will we be meeting at the middle school next week?
It's listed as middle school next week.
Middle school next week?
Middle school next
It's
week,
listed
yes.
as a community
Can I make one suggestion?
Absolutely.
Could we in the future manage some sort of small podium or something for people to put the papers on?
Sure.
I know, I was gonna mention it last time and I forgot.
Makes sense. All right. Hearing none. Then I have asked John, as he took the opportunity, or as he took care of the nominating thing to fulfill, to put Dana in this position, I've asked John to also head up the nominating committee for reorganization for our next year here. So thank you, John, for being willing to do that again. This is the second time in our meeting for public comments. Again, no public here, so with that, board, I will take a motion to adjourn to executive session for legal and personnel reasons.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.